So, Title Update 3 has arrived today, and that means that I'm hard at work cracking codes to make the next meta video for you as soon as possible. In the meantime, this is me talking about methodology and behind-the-scenes Metarama stuff. Originally, I was trying to pre-record all of this to add it into the Title Update 3 meta video, but as you can see by the runtime, it probably deserves its own video, so here we are. So fair warning, if I allude to talking about what the current metasets are in the video, it's not actually in this video, it's in the next one. So without further ado, let's go. So before we go deep diving into metasets, I want to slow down and address a few things. I've had a couple of comments on my last meta video asking me to explain my methodology. Now, I touched on that stuff in the older videos, so I thought that would have been fine for the later ones, but in hindsight, probably not the smartest idea to assume that everyone has watched the earlier meta videos, so my bad. Let's go over how I work this stuff out. Starting at the start, how you use the weapon affects how you want to build your armor sets, and in turn which weapons you want to bring. The easy example are the thunder weapons, because we have a lot of variance between different thunder lances. If we assume that you're getting buffs from Anchor Rage and Defensive Guard with a high uptime, sort of 60 to 80%, then Lance becomes very raw focused, because both of those skills add percentage increases to your raw. And in turn, that makes weapons like the Zenoga Lance or the Kodachi Lance win out over lances like Nawa's, because the situation is favoring raw damage over element damage. On the flip side, if you're not using those skills, and instead decide to use attacks that have a high element to raw ratio, think leaping thrust, then Nawa is going to start outperforming the other Thunder Lances. In theory, stacking extra raw with Anchor Rage and Offensive Guard is always going to be the stronger option. However, there are numerous monsters where that's not exactly possible, and that's also ignoring the fact that you have to activate Anchor Rage and Offensive Guard, which might cause some inconsistency, especially when looking at things like the freestyle speedruns, where they're able to incapacitate the monster for most of the fight. For this video and for the previous meta videos and future meta videos, unless I state otherwise, I'll assume that you can Anchor Rage and Offensive Guard consistently. That might make some wonky results, thinking of Shogun Senator largely, but if there's interest, I can go over some specific armor sets for the specific niche cases when they crop up. So comment below if that's something that you'd want. Getting back on topic, the skills themselves aren't always going to be active. So I've done a lot of testing to find the average uptimes of skills, and I've used those. Unfortunately, that means mileage will vary. Currently, I'm trying to get the spreadsheet to a state where it can be shared, and when we get to that point, you'll be able to make a copy of the spreadsheet and just fine tweak your own sets with the parameters that are true to you. But in the meantime, the parameters that I assume are 80% uptime for Offensive Guard and Anchor Rage, 60% uptime for Agitator, and I'm assuming that you have about 6 hits before your burst or chain crit resets itself. When factoring in skills like Bloodlust, I'm assuming a 40% uptime of Coalescence, and 20% for Resuscitate coming from Bloodlust itself. Then we've got the other skills like Dragonheart, Peak Performance, that I also assume uptimes for, but as of writing they tend not to be meta skills, so you probably don't need to worry about them. It's about 80% for Dragonheart, and about 60 to 70% are for peak performance. But we're glossing over them because making uptimes for those skills is so variable that it's sort of mumbo-jumbo hogwash. That is not the case with the other skills. One thing I'd like to add before moving on is that there's a little bit of a divide at the moment between set builders that want to assume 100% uptime for things and set builders that want to assume percentage uptimes for skills. Personally, I think that assuming 100% is no better, and in fact possibly worse, than assuming percentage uptimes, as it's just as assumptive, so it's better to get a close estimate rather than just blindly assuming everything to be 100%. However, there's a divide for a reason, and if you want to make sets with the 100% uptime assumed, that's a-okay. The other half of assuming skill uptimes are the combos. As I mentioned earlier, this can and will vary results. In my videos, I'm assuming that you're using optimal charge-wide sweep leaping thrust combos as often as possible, but with a sprinkling of insta-blocks and anchorages to keep those skill up times where they need to be. Obviously, this assumes a few things. Firstly, that the monster can attack you to activate those insta-blocks, that you're hitting all of those hits on the weak points, which can be difficult with cross-sweep, and finally that you're consistent at timing the charged wide sweep well to make it efficient. Mileage will vary, and you can definitely get good results by not fighting like I'm assuming you are, especially if you're using a lot of crowd control with paradogs and traps. The other side of combos are monster hit zones. Obviously, the whole purpose of armor sets is to take them and use them against monsters. So building them without specific monster hit zones in mind is kind of silly. So the assumptions that I'm making here are that you can actually hit the weak points of the monster. I've taken the best hit zones of each monster and used that as an assumption for what weapon to bring to it. And you can see that listed on the sides of the chart. There are a few exceptions because some monsters are awkward. I'm obviously not expecting you to be able to hit Pookie Pookie's tongue for the entire duration of the fight. And I've also left some extra hit zones on the table for certain monsters. Things like Aurora Somnicant's Frills or Anjanath's Frills are on the table in case you want to spam Skyward Thrust against these hit zones or whatever. Basically, they're not the most ideal hit zone, but they are very accessible, and I know that a lot of people struggle against certain monsters. Or, to be specific, struggle hitting certain monster weak points. Going back to the table, we've also got some situations where the value of element changes as the monster powers up during the fight. Biggest example that I can think of off the top of my head is Lunagoron. And just to be clear here, you can see the hit zones labelled on the sides of the charts, so you'll know which hit zone or which state the monster's in. But the purpose of having both is so that you can decide for yourself how often he's in which state and which lance to bring. Using Lunagoron as an example, normal Lunagoron, he's probably very raw focused. He doesn't stay in his angry super werewolf mode very often. But on the flip side, afflicted Lunagoron likes to stay in that state, so being more elementally favorable for afflicted Lunagoron might help out. Finally, another big issue with recommending lances is how good your augments are. Will greatly affect which lances to use. way back when we first got access to curio augments, one of the ideas I was planning was figuring out what the meta set would be for the legal maximum end of curio augments. The long story short was, with no augments, the weapons with long white sharpness bars were the strongest. Think of Aknasom and Ludroth. But as you got some good augments, that would quickly switch over to weapons with short purple sharpness, as you were able to manage the sharpness now. Think of Rathalos and Mizutsune. But right at the top, where you were basically modding in curio augments, it would switch back to weapons like Aknasom and Ludroth, because you had so much space on your armor that you could get all the damage skills and then all the sharpness management to get functionally infinite purple on those weapons. The issue, and the reason why that video never came to fruition, was because I checked the probability of getting some of these augments, and the probability was so low that it was impossible. We're talking about 3 billion hours of grinding just to have a 1% chance to get one of your 5 armor pieces. At that rarity, it's absurd to think that anyone running around with that kind of thing has obtained it legitimately. So I didn't really want to make a video specifically for people that were hacking the game. Going back to why I'm saying this, what augments you have and how good they are will change which lances are best for you. Unfortunately, there isn't an easy way around this, so I've assumed a reasonable +1 skill on each armor set, as that's something that is aspirational but realistically obtainable by anyone that wants to play the game. There's also a list of armor sets that could realistically gain +2 to their overall efficiency or skill efficiency by getting a slot increase and a good skill, but even then, actually getting a roll like that is really difficult and will cost you thousands and thousands of melds. Just a quick addendum, I've just seen the Title Update 3 dev diary, and it seems like they're going to make getting skills easier in the coming update. So we might need to call a rain check on the part that I just mentioned. Now, the next issue is poison. Poison has been made largely viable thanks to Risen Chameleos' armor, but actually mathing out how much damage poison, or status as a whole, gives is incredibly difficult. And this is because monsters get more resistant to status the more procs you apply, to a point at least. So you can't do a load of hunts, cut a load of slices out of them, get an average and go, that's how much poison damage we're doing. Instead, you have to model it, and then extract how much poison damage you do from that model. And this is how we do it. The spreadsheet will take a look at the status on your weapon after you've applied any modifiers to it, like Poison Attack or Chameleos Blessing, and then it's going to estimate how much poison status we deal using the hits per second and hunt time that we've added into the spreadsheet, allowing us to estimate how much poison we deal over the course of the hunt and roughly when the poison procs, which in turn allows us to estimate the DPS of poison, which we can then add to the expected DPS of the weapons / the armor set to give us a combined DPS, which we can then compare to other weapons. You might be thinking that assuming hits per second and hunt time isn't ideal when calculating poison, but unfortunately it's the most sane option. Ideally, you'd use monster health as a more concrete example of when the hunt is finished, but in doing so, you still have to assume how many hits you're doing per second, but now you also have to try and factor in how much poison damage you're doing to figure out when the hunt finishes, because obviously the poison damage contributes to finishing the hunt, and at that point you're figuring out how much poison damage you're doing to figure out how much poison damage you're doing. The next thing you know, you're in Wonderland and Alice is force-feeding you crumpets. However, this is a model of poison, so there are some issues that might make it differ from actual hunting. Firstly, if the skill Camellia's Blessing is equipped, it's going to assume that you're always activating Camellia's Blessing, which may not always be the case. Camellia's Blessing is a bit funny in the way that it doubles the length of your poison proc, because it's only going to activate if you're the person that deals the last bit of poison damage. So if you're the one to proc the last bit of poison to activate the poison proc, then you get it. But if your dog procs it, or if your friend who isn't using Camellia's Blessing activates the poison, then Camellia's Blessing does nothing. Speaking of the length of poison procs, one of the limitations of calculating poison is that I've turned it into blast. What I mean by this is that once the spreadsheet reads that a poison proc has activated, it will act as if that proc has happened all at once and that you've dealt the entire 20 to 40 seconds of poison in that instance. Unfortunately, that invites the possibility that it will overestimate the value of poison if you kill a monster really quickly, as it's not taking into account that poison cannot be produced again until the last poison ends. However, this isn't as big of a flaw as you might be thinking it is. As your hunts go on, the overlapping of status procs gets smoothed out because it gets harder to proc status the later into the hunt. And hopefully I've got a graph to show it, and I'll put that on screen somewhere. The spreadsheet has also got a really handy feature to hard cap the DPS of poison, so that you can never get more damage from the poison than if the monster was poisoned for the entire fight. And it's also going to calculate when the first proc of poison would happen. So if you couldn't proc poison until 30 seconds into the fight, then it would take 30 seconds off the hunt time that you've inputted, and then assume that that period of time is the maximum possible poison DPS that you can get. And by doing that, it makes our model of poison really accurate. So, hypothetically, if you plugged a hacked amount of poison into the chart, like 999 poison, then the spreadsheet will read it as if the monster is always poisoned when it is possible to be poisoned, rather than assuming that poison is genuinely like blast and giving you tons and tons and tons of extra poison damage. And that's all we have time for. I'm recording this outro quite close to the next title update, and I'm super excited for it. I'd be really interested to see what you guys think of the new content, especially if you have any hunches on what's going to be meta or what skills to look into. I'm trying to get the next video out as soon as possible, so if you don't want to miss the new meta, why not subscribe and turn the notification bell on so that you can get the video as soon as it's published. And finally, thanks for watching. See you next time.